Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, Tim Connelly's contract restructure. He will be back next year. We'll talk about the details of that and how else it may shift here over the course of the summer. We'll also start our player review series, starting with the two-way contract players, Luka Garza, Jalen Clark, and Daishen Nix. It's all upcoming on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Happy Hump Day. And lots to get to here today. The big news, of course, Tim Connelly has restructured his contract, will be back with the team for the next year. We'll talk through the details of that, what that means, what it doesn't mean, perhaps. And also, I want to get to the start of our player review series. And I want to start with the two-way contract players at the end of the Wolves bench, at the end of their roster. So we'll do all that here today on the show. A big thank you off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with two B's, two E's, C-K-E-N. All right. So the headliner, of course, here is Tim Connelly. According to Shams Charania, the team has not, as of this recording, officially announced anything. And I'm not sure if they will, actually. But according to Shams Charania and John Krasinski of The Athletic, the Timberwolves president of basketball operations, Tim Connelly, has agreed to a restructured contract with the team. The news, of course, a few weeks ago was there was all this talk about how Tim Connelly, well, this was a lucrative deal that got him to Minnesota a couple of summers ago from Denver. And, promises of an ownership stake in the team and like all this stuff for Tim Connelly, a minor ownership slice, not like the major, but related ownership squabble ongoing. But, the compensation and all that stuff, there was an opt-out of the deal for this year. And there began to be, we talked about the Minnesota basketball party right here on the Locked On Wolves feed a couple of Wednesdays ago, that there was kind of this thought that it would make sense, given the current ownership, we'll call it unrest in Minnesota, the pending ownership change that's now going to arbitration here over the course of the summer, that Tim Connelly would opt out of his deal, use that leverage to gain or to land himself a new contract extension for even more money in years in Minnesota. Or if he really wanted to and is fed up with the whole thing, he could leave. He was rumored as a candidate for the Detroit Pistons job that went to Trajan Langdon, the former Pelicans GM. So there's certainly leverage to be had for Tim Connelly. So the expectation of those of us on the basketball party show a couple of weeks ago was, hey, he'll probably opt out and he'll probably resign. He didn't do any of the above, but he agreed to a restructured contract. So he never hit the open market. But what the Wolves are reportedly doing, according to Shams and John Krasinski, is essentially pushing his opt-out clause to next summer. And of course, what this allows him to do is sit back and watch and see how the ownership situation gets hashed out. Also, this is a big summer for the Timberwolves. It's a big decisions to be made related to the salary situation, the second apron that they're about to be over. We talked about that a little bit on Mondays and Tuesdays shows this week. But it allows Tim Conley to see, does this ownership transition happen? Does Glenn Taylor ultimately have to cede control the majority stake in the team to the Mark Lowry, Alex Rodriguez group, or does it stay in Glenn Taylor's hands? And it certainly feels like if it's the latter, if Glenn Taylor's in control 12 months from now, Tim Connelly may decide to opt out. Now, on the flip side, kind of the crux of the issue, allegedly, with Lowry and Rodriguez's group is lack of liquid assets, liquid capital to fully acquire the team, according to Glenn Taylor. Now, of course, Lowry and Rodriguez have disputed that. Who knows? But there is an argument to be made that, hey, if Glenn Taylor still owns the team, then maybe they're more likely to go over the second apron or to pay that tax or pay the repeater penalty, which is an astronomical price. I don't know that I buy that. I certainly think the Lori Rodriguez ownership group is better for this team long term. I'm not at all disputing that point, but there certainly are some disputes, a lot of disputes that again, the finances are the issue. Does this group have the money, and will they be willing to pay? Because there's also reports out there. The most recent report from ESPN, Tim McMahon said, literally used the word slashed related to what would happen to payroll if Lori and Rodriguez took over. And of course, there was a report several weeks ago, and I'm forgetting who I should credit here, but that the proposed budget for the next fiscal year from the A-Rod Lori group showed the Timberwolves getting underneath that apron and cutting payroll. Now, of course, that's a pretty common business practice, is to like, hey, let's model this out. What's the projection here? And of course, the people who are writing the checks, investors, et cetera, are going to want to see a scenario where, hey, we're not paying these penalties. And so that surely plays into this as well. So there's a lot floating around here, admittedly. But the most important headline here is Tim Connelly is under contract now for the following 12 months-ish until after next season. He could opt out next summer, and that could just lead to a longer-term extension. And if Lori and Rodriguez are in charge, if they're the majority owners, they led the charge to bring him from Denver and got Glenn Taylor on board back when the three of them were on speaking terms and were working together on this. By all accounts, Lori and Rodriguez were the ones who led the charge to acquire Tim Connelly from Denver, to lure him away from the Nuggets. And so, of course, if they're in charge, they're going to want to keep Tim Connelly. So as long as they are capable of paying whatever penalties they need to for being over the second apron and willing to do that, then I don't see how that's not a better scenario. And then that leads to Tim Connelly being here longer term. If Glenn Taylor maintains control, and I mean, hey, like Brian Windhorst said that he was skeptical that Lori Rodriguez would get the team by the fall, for whatever that's worth, even though it seems like conventional wisdom is like, hey, Glenn Taylor doesn't really have a leg to stand on here other than getting cold feet. If they actually proved that they had the money, which Lori Rodriguez have said that they did, then it should be their team based on their purchase agreement. So there's a lot of layers here, of course. But again, the most important thing is that Tim Connelly is back for at least the next year, potentially longer. And if Lori Rodriguez ultimately gain majority control of the team, it seems that as though Connelly would be here even longer. So a massive thing for Timberwolves fans. And we'll see how this ownership stuff plays out. Arbitration's happening at some point this summer, so there's going to be lots of reporting on that at some point that we'll have to talk through as well. But overall, a very good thing for Minnesota, and lots for Tim Connelly and company to do this offseason. Of course, 2 draft picks. We talked about that on Tuesday's show, the 27 and 37 pick. Lots to prepare for with the draft just a few weeks away. There's lots of draft workouts out there, by the way, that the Wolves have conducted. I'll kind of just briefly touch on that, and also some Mike and Ori stuff here next. And then I want to get into the player review series. We'll talk about the 2-way contract players on the roster. I think we'll get to all 3 of them here today: Daishen Nix, Luka Garza, and Jalen Clark. I may save some Jalen Clark depending on timing here for Wednesday or for Thursday's show. So lots to get to here today. Still today on the show, we'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is sponsored by our friends over at BetterHelp. We all carry around different stressors, both big and small. And when we keep them bottled up, it can start to affect us negatively. Therapy is a safe space to get things off your chest and to figure out how to work through whatever might be weighing you down. And look, Timberwolves fans, I know the end of the playoffs, the end of the season overall, came a little bit quicker than I think we all expected once this team got past the second round. And while recognizing surely there's people that are listening to this that have bigger issues than the result of the Timberwolves season or the final result of the season, it's important to acknowledge that everyone's going through something. And hey, look, we're all disappointed with how this thing ended. I didn't think there was any world in which the Mavs-Wolves series was a Mavs win in 5 games. I thought that was one of the least likely scenarios. And it certainly has weighed on me. And it certainly weighed on others. And again, acknowledging that there's other issues out there. It's important to acknowledge that whatever you're going through, it may help to talk to somebody. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Get it off your chest with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. Do you watch Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day long? If so, no doubt you have to turn down the volume because of all the shouting. Instead, make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Okay, couple quick news items to hear. Mention the draft workouts. There's lots of reports out there about guys the Wolves are working out. After the Wolves didn't have a first-round pick last year, it's fun to see them kind of back in the mix. There's plenty of guys that they've worked out. The one from a couple days ago, they had Baylor Shireman from Creighton, who's probably a top 30 ranked guy based on a lot of lists, possibly a first-round pick. He was in along with several other players, French player, Jalen Bridges from Baylor, several other guys were in as well. And then there was another workout the Wolves had that included, they had Juan Nunez in, a Spanish point guard who's number 37 on the ESPN board. He worked out for the Wolves. He's a point guard. And then they had several guys, I guess, highlighted by Pell Larson from Arizona in to work out. He's probably a second-round pick based on most of his prospect rankings, and some other guys that are borderline second-round undrafted guys. That's kind of the stage in the process the Wolves are at. So if there's anybody notable or anyone that like the Wolves are legitimately linked to, if there's any smoke or steam around a particular name at either 27 or 37 for Minnesota, we'll jump into that and spend some time on it if and when that happens. But as I said before the other day on the show, I mean, the draft we're almost 3 weeks out from the draft. So once we get to 10-ish, 12-ish days out, we'll spend a lot more time on potential prospects. It's still a little early, and I want to get through the player review series first. One other non-player related note, Micah Nori, of course, the fantastic assistant coach who patrolled the sidelines in the stead of Chris Finch for the entirety of the second round of the conference finals, had already interviewed for the Lakers head coaching job. We knew he was a candidate. And then he will also interview, or at least the Wolves granted permission to the Cleveland Cavaliers to interview Micah Nori for the role formerly held by former Timberwolves coach and former Golden Gopher JB Bickerstaff. Nori, will be a candidate along with a bunch of other guys. Kenny Atkinson and James Borrego both have previous head coaching experience in the NBA. Their candidates, also Johnny Bryant and Chris Quinn, assistants with the Knicks and Heat, respectively, are candidates. So, given that Nori hasn't been a lead assistant until recently, is still relatively young, I'd be a little surprised if he got either of those jobs, especially we know JJ Redick is the reportedly very much so the leading candidate for the Lakers job. He's announcing the finals for ABC. So if he's the guy, it's going to be a little bit before they announce that. I would think Nori's got a shot. He's from Ohio. Micah Nori is, so perhaps he does have a shot at that Cavs job. But reportedly, Kenny Atkinson is the front runner for that from via multiple outlets. So best of luck to Micah Nori for in terms of landing one of those jobs. That'd be great for him, and obviously good luck for Chris Finch and the Wolves staff as well. All right, I want to spend the rest of the show here today talking about the Timberwolves two-way players this year. This is the first year the Wolves could have 3 two-way players. They immediately signed after the draft last year. I shouldn't say immediately, but shortly after the draft last year, they signed Jalen Clark to a 2-year, two-way deal. Jalen Clark was a second-round pick, tore his Achilles near the end of the season for UCLA last year, so just over a calendar year ago, and was widely considered pretty much the best perimeter defender, point of attack defender, if anybody in college in the 22-23 season before tearing his Achilles. He couldn't even participate in March Madness, so he slid all the way into the middle of the second round, and the Wolves got him at a bargain in terms of draft value. So we'll talk about him here in a little bit. but he was one of the picks. He was one of the two-way players. Of course, hasn't set foot on an NBA or G League court even for a game to this point. He started practicing with the Iowa Wolves towards the end of the season, back in February, March timeframe, but did not play in a game this year at all, recovering from the Achilles surgery. The Timberwolves did have Daishen Nix and Luka Garza in two-way deals. I know Garza was converted to a standard contract, first week of April or so, which is great. Got paid more money, had a little bit of security. He filled that last Wolves roster spot eventually. So we'll spend some time on him, but I'm still lumping him in with the two-way conversation here. But we'll start with Daishen Nix. I have the least to say about Daishen. Last offseason, when the Timberwolves brought in Daishen Nix, I was not all that excited about the pickup. And as it turns out, sure enough, he didn't end up doing very much on the court. Now, clearly, he was a prominent bench presence. Started the pointing on the posterizing, when guys got dunked on or when guys dunked on other guys. Started the pointing fad. I don't want to call it a fad. It continued. And I'm sure had a locker room presence that mattered. I didn't like his addition just from the get-go in terms of what he brought to the table. Remember last year in training camp, they brought in Javante Cook, who is somebody who'd been with them in Summer League, Trevor Keels, the former Knicks guy, Vit Krejci, who ended up going back to Atlanta after OKC, Minnesota, and then I think back to Atlanta this year, if I remember right, and then Daishen Nix. And Nix was actually my least favorite of those four guys. Good size, 6'4", 6'7" wingspan for really a point guard. And he's a good passer, but he's more of a combo guard, more of a scoring mindset, but he's never been an efficient scorer. He's never been a very good shooter. And he played a bunch for Houston last year as a 20-year-old second-year guy. He was a prospect in the 2020 class, so he didn't even play college basketball, and showed flashes with Houston, but it was much more of a, again, high volume but low efficiency scorer. And that's what we saw in extremely limited action this year. He didn't see any rotation minutes this season for Minnesota. I'm pretty confident he never saw anything but garbage. I'm going to pull up his game log real quick, but I don't think there was ever a moment. He played 10 minutes in their win against Utah on November 30th, which was only an 11-point win. He might have actually played rotation minutes in that game. Now I don't remember that at all, which is a very weird thing. They were really short-handed that game. They didn't have Jordan McLaughlin. He was injured. They didn't have weird. Oh, they didn't have Anthony Edwards in that game either. So Daishen Nix did play rotation minutes in one game this year, back on November 30th. No Ant, no Jordan McLaughlin. Otherwise, his only court time this season was all garbage time. In that game against Utah, for what it's worth, he shot 1 of 5, 1 of 4 on threes. 1 rebound, no assists in 10 minutes, no turnovers either. But one game he played rotation minutes this year. And in the G League, he didn't actually play much in the G League either. He spent a lot of the year on the Wolves roster and just not playing. In the Showcase Cup with Iowa, he averaged 19.7 points, 5.5 assists, but he shot just 21% on threes over 6 games, 37% from the floor. The regular season with Iowa, he was 42% from the floor, 27% from three, 25 points, 6 assists. So again, low efficiency, high volume, good passer. Everything I just said, actually. Pretty, good steal rate as well. He's not a great defender because he's not super quick laterally, but he's a big body and a relatively savvy player. I just don't see a world in which he's more than a fourth point guard, which is a two-way guy. Now, he's still really young. He's what? 20. He's 22. He doesn't turn 23 until February, so he's still young. And it wouldn't shock me. I mean, he's going to be in camp with somebody next year, but it really feels like he's somebody who's going to go play overseas, more likely than not. So I was just never a big fan of the signing, but clearly he had an impact on the team, and really was on the team from start to finish this year as a two-way guy. Was ever present on the bench. Just not a whole lot to say about his performance this year. What I want to do next is I want to talk about Luka Garza. And I think I'll save Jalen Clark for Thursday's show because I want to spend a little bit more time on Jalen. I think there's a legit shot Jalen Clark sees minutes next year with this team. And I'm excited about seeing him. So I want to spend a little more time on him. But we'll spend the last segment talking about Luka Garza here today. Potential, what's the future look like for Luka and this team? Is there a future for Luka on the Timberwolves? So we'll do all of that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and the NHL. Of course, the finals and the Stanley Cup finals starting this week. FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. The Boston Celtics are 6.5-point favorites for game one of the finals, which is, of course, tomorrow night, Thursday night, 7:30 Central. And if you want to take the Mavs to win game one, plus 200 money line. That's not the worst. That's not the worst odds. Luka's the best player in the series. Overall for the series, Boston's minus 225 to win the finals. The Mavs are plus 188. I mentioned the MVP odds yesterday as well. Tatum's minus 125, but Luka plus 210 is pretty tasty. If you think there's any shot, like if there's any credence to like Mavs are more battle tested, their rest difference is only a couple of days at this point in terms of like layoff before the finals. And Luka's the best player in the series. Jason Tatum's great. And the Celtics are a better pound for pound team. They're a better regular season team by far over the Mavs. But Luka's the best player on the floor. So Luka at plus 210 for finals MVP is not the worst bet you can find out there. Again, $150 for new customers in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, we got to talk about Luka Garza. So Luka Garza last offseason was a restricted free agent after being on a two-way deal with Minnesota the year prior. They signed him to another two-way deal. He ultimately was converted to a standard deal in April because the Wolves had to add another player to their bench to fill the minimum roster requirement. We saw this post-trade deadline. They traded Shake Milton and Troy Brown Jr. 2-for-1 to bring in Monte Morris, and then they signed TJ Warren. They needed to end up signing another player because they carried a vacant spot basically all season. So Luka Garza ends up getting that spot. So technically he's not a two-way free agent, but he is a restricted free agent for Minnesota. He actually played less games and less minutes this year than in his rookie season with Detroit a couple of years ago or last year with Minnesota. Rotation minutes were very limited. However, when he got rotation minutes, he was effective. And like the Wolves brought him back for a couple of reasons. Very clearly, similar to Daishen Nix, he's somebody who they felt was a valuable practice guy, a valuable locker room guy, a valuable bench guy to have during the season. And that's just that's a credit to Luka Garza, right? I mean, that's great for him, great for Daishen Nix. There's a reason they brought these guys in. They also saw Garza as a viable depth piece in the event that they had a ton of injuries, he could play. And we saw, I think it was a little bit of an indictment last year when they had all the injuries, when Gobert was banged up, Towns missed a ton of time. And they didn't actually, Garza did get some rotation minutes last year, but not heavy rotation minutes. And so I was a little surprised they brought him back at all for that reason, because clearly they didn't really trust him all that much. But they brought him back. And the idea is you can plug and play him. He'll compete. He'll play hard. He'll be a body defensively, give you some fouls, grab some rebounds. And he's super skilled offensively. You just can't put him in space on anyone. Like, for instance, the Mavs matchup would have been an absolute nightmare for Luka Garza because, he just, I love Luka Garza. He doesn't have the lateral quickness to guard pick and roll in the NBA. And he's improved. He's reshaped his body. He's gotten better where he needs to get better to be an NBA player. And he is an NBA player. He's just not an NBA rotation guy. He did see some rotation minutes in March when Cat was out. And there were some other injuries, and Rudy hurt himself in that Clippers game. So Garza played 13 minutes at Utah, and then the next 2 nights later played 11 minutes at Utah. Played well in both those games. And then remember that home game against Denver? Timberwolves Nuggets, March 13th. And March 19th, excuse me. Rudy did not play in that game. It was the third straight game he missed. So there's no Rudy. There was no Karl-Anthony Towns. The Timberwolves started Kyle Anderson at center, Jaden McDaniels at the 4, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Anthony Edwards, and Mike Conley in the backcourt. And Garza played 22 minutes off the bench, had 11.6 rebounds, and did a great job guarding Nikola Jokic. This was the game where the bench was Garza playing 22 minutes, Monte Morris played 23 minutes, McLaughlin played 18 minutes, and TJ Warren played 9 minutes shortly after signing with Minnesota. And I mean, Jokic had a great game. He had 35 points on 22 shots, 16 boards, but he only had 2 assists. He had 3 turnovers. The Wolves ended up only losing by 3, and they had a shot late in that game. Did Anthony Edwards miss a 3 at the buzzer in this game, or am I confusing that with another game? It might have been this game. All that to say, that kind of 3-game stretch, the 2 games at Utah and the home game against Denver, which was 3 games in 4 nights, was a pretty good snapshot of what Luka Garza can bring to the table, and it showed some of his limitations. He was not super efficient offensively. He was okay, but not great on the glass. He was solid defensively in certain matchups, but he was also exposed. And that's Luka Garza's future as an NBA player, is a 4th or 5th big, good locker room guy, good energy guy, good bench guy, skilled offensively when given the opportunity. But he's not going to be more than a 4th big on an NBA team, because remember, he's also an older prospect. So he's already 25. He turns 26 right after Christmas this year, December 27th. So he's already entering his athletic prime here in the next year. And, love to see him back in Minnesota. I don't think he can sign another 2-way deal. I could be wrong about that. I could see him as a minimum contract guy, depending on how you need to fill out a roster. And maybe that is back in Minnesota. The Wolves need to sign a bunch of minimum guys. We'll talk a lot more about that this offseason. But to fill the roster, they're going to have to sign minimum guys. And, the one thing is, like, clearly they're not super comfortable with playing him unless they have to. So could you better use that minimum spot on somebody else? Maybe. But he continued. He didn't get a whole lot of run in the G League this year because, just like Daishen Nix, he spent a lot of the year with Minnesota. He only played 3 Showcase Cup games with Iowa. He averaged 37 and 12, shot 57% from the floor in those 3 Showcase games that he had with the Iowa Wolves. Did not play any regular season games with them, so he just played in the Showcase Cup. Of course, was a G League All-Star, G League MVP at the All-Star game, all that stuff last year. So he's proven everything he can prove as a super skilled big with good size. And again, so much offensive skill and a really nice stroke from outside the arc. There's nothing more he can prove at the G League. He's the basketball equivalent of a 4A player. That's what they say in baseball. There's a guy who crushes AAA but can't quite hack it in the big leagues. Luka Garza is the 4A player. He's whatever you want to put in between the G League and the NBA. And he's going to be on a roster somewhere next year. I believe that. Whether it's Minnesota or somewhere else, someone's going to sign him to a minimum deal, and he'll be in the league because of all that offensive skill and the intangibles he brings too. Being a hard worker, all that stuff does matter. And there's a time and a place for Luka Garza. I think he's a nice player. And offensively, there aren't many weaknesses. He can kind of do it all in terms of a modern NBA big. It's the defensive limitations more than anything else. All right. Like I said, I want to talk Jaylen Clark on Thursday's show. We'll start there. And really what I typically do in the offseason is I sort the roster by minutes played, and I back my way up. And I'm making a little bit of an exception with Jaylen Clark since he didn't play, but he's still under contract. And I lumped Garza in with Nix as a 2-way guy. So next we go Jaylen Clark. We'll talk Leonard Miller, last year's other rookie, in addition to Jaylen Clark. We'll talk Wendell Moore Jr. That's likely the next show. I'll do those 3, and then we'll get on to Josh Minott. We'll talk, and then I'll probably kind of breeze through TJ Warren and Monte Morris because I doubt either one of them's back next year, but you never know. So we'll talk about those guys. And again, as part of this, we'll do what did their year look like relative to expectations? How do they provide? What was their role? And could they be back next year? If so, what does that look like? So we'll do that with each of these guys. Going to be a ton of fun going through the whole roster. And of course, keeping an eye on other rumors and things that are out there, news related to Connelly, coaching, rumor mill stuff, etc. And then we'll get into draft coverage here in the next couple weeks as well. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.